Have you heard that Britain made it illegal for Indians to collect salt from their own beaches? Not diamonds, not gold, salt, the mineral freely available in seawater along thousands of miles of Indian coastline. Britain taxed it so heavily that salt consumption in India became the lowest per capita in the world, made collecting seawater salt a criminal offense punishable by 6 months' imprisonment. Built a physical barrier called the Inland Customs Line across the entire country, with armed guards to prevent salt smuggling. Between 1882 and 1883, over 8,300 people were convicted in just the Madras Presidency for the crime of processing salt from their own soil. Revenue officers could break down doors without warrants, seize contraband salt, detain and search anyone they suspected. And here's the truly perverse part. The salt tax generated 8.2% of total British Raj revenue. 8.2% of the entire colonial budget came from taxing a substance necessary for human survival that was literally everywhere for free. Indians were paying Britain to enforce the laws that prevented them from collecting their own salt. So what changed? How did a substance freely available in nature become a criminal commodity? It didn't change. Britain just had the guns and the legal system to enforce an extraction mechanism so brutal that people died from salt deficiency while standing next to an ocean full of salt. But here's the real question. When you tax survival itself, when you criminalize access to something the human body needs to live, how long before people decide your empire has no right to exist? Because in 1930, a 60-year-old man walked 240 miles to a beach, bent down, picked up a handful of muddy salt, and the British Empire began to crumble. This is extraction at its most naked, and this is how it ends. Let's start with how Britain engineered this system, because the salt monopoly wasn't gradual. It was immediate and deliberate. In 1764, the moment the British East India Company gained control of Bengal after the Battle of Buxar, they established a salt monopoly. Not years later, not after consolidating power. Immediately. Robert Clive, the same man who had conquered Bengal through bribery and treachery at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, made salt a personal monopoly of senior East India Company officers. They could directly profit from controlling something every Indian needed every single day. In 1768, the monopoly was briefly annulled under pressure from London, but in 1780 Warren Hastings, the Governor-General, reinstated it permanently. Then, in 1882, the Indian Salt Act codified everything into comprehensive law with enforcement mechanisms that would make a police state proud. The salt tax was set at 1 rupee 4 annas per mond, which is 82 pounds of salt. For the poorest Indians, this represented a devastating portion of their income for a substance they could collect from the ocean for free if it weren't illegal. The law specified that only government salt depots could legally produce salt. Private production carried 6 months' imprisonment. Revenue officers received extraordinary powers that would be recognizable to anyone familiar with totalitarian enforcement. They could break down doors without warrants, seize contraband, detain, search, and arrest anyone suspected of illegal salt possession or production. No due process, no appeals, just immediate arrest and imprisonment. The scale of enforcement was massive. Between 1882 and 1883, over 8,300 people were convicted in Madras Presidency alone. That's just one administrative region in 1 year. Multiply that across decades and across all of India, and you're looking at hundreds of thousands of people imprisoned for the crime of collecting seawater salt. Most of these convictions were for processing salt from their own soil, not even collecting seawater salt, but literally processing the salt that naturally occurred in their own land. Britain made it illegal for Indians to process minerals from their own property. Think about the psychological impact of that. You own land. Salt crystallizes naturally on that land. You collect it. You're arrested and imprisoned. The message was clear: you own nothing. Britain owns everything, including the minerals that form naturally on land you've owned for generations. But laws alone weren't enough. Britain needed infrastructure to enforce this monopoly because India has thousands of miles of coastline where salt can be easily harvested through simple solar evaporation. So Britain built the Inland Customs Line, a physical barrier stretching across India with armed guards stationed at intervals to prevent salt from being smuggled from coastal areas to the interior. This wasn't a metaphorical barrier. This was an actual wall with actual armed men whose job was to stop Indians from moving salt they had collected themselves. The absurdity is staggering. Britain built a wall inside India to prevent Indians from transporting a substance freely available in nature. The Transport of Salt Act of 1879 reinforced this by restricting sea transport of salt with penalties of 1,000 rupees or imprisonment. Multiple overlapping laws created a comprehensive control system. The Bengal Salt Act of 1838, the Madras Salt Act of 1884, the Bombay Salt Act of 1890, all operating under the overarching Indian Salt Act of 1882. This wasn't simple taxation. This was a totalitarian control system backed by criminal law and enforced by armed colonial police. The economic impact was devastating in ways that are hard to overstate. Salt consumption per capita in India became the lowest in the world because people literally couldn't afford enough salt to maintain health. Salt isn't optional. It's essential for nerve function, muscle contraction, blood pressure regulation, and maintaining fluid balance. In a hot climate where people sweat heavily from manual labor, inadequate salt intake causes serious health problems. Muscle cramps, fatigue, heat exhaustion, and in extreme cases, death. But we're dying from salt deficiency while living next to an ocean full of salt. The salt tax was brutally regressive, meaning it hit the poorest hardest. Wealthy Indians could afford the taxed salt and were merely inconvenienced. Poor Indians faced an impossible choice: malnutrition from inadequate salt intake or imprisonment for collecting salt illegally. Many chose crime. They collected salt at night, they smuggled it, they processed it in secret, and thousands were caught and imprisoned annually. Here's the perverse genius of the extraction mechanism. Britain didn't even use good salt. They imported inferior Cheshire salt from Liverpool, shipped it thousands of miles across the ocean, and sold it in a country surrounded by thousands of miles of coastline with perfect natural conditions for salt harvesting. India has ideal solar salt production conditions. Shallow coastal areas, high evaporation rates, abundant sunshine. Salt production in India should cost almost nothing. But Britain made natural salt harvesting illegal and forced Indians to buy imported British salt at inflated prices. The revenue generated, 8.2% of total British Raj revenue, funded the colonial administration, the army that enforced British rule, the bureaucracy that extracted wealth, the infrastructure that facilitated extraction, the police that arrested people for collecting salt. Indians were literally paying for their own subjugation. The colonizers didn't need to fund the colony from Britain. They made the colonized pay for being colonized through a tax on survival. This is late-stage empire extraction in its purest, most naked form. Find something universally needed, monopolize it through law backed by violence, criminalize alternatives, tax heavily, use the revenue to fund the system that enforces the monopoly. It's a self-sustaining extraction mechanism that feeds on itself. The salt tax remained in force for decades, generating steady revenue while causing immense suffering across the entire population. But empires that tax survival create the conditions for their own destruction because survival taxes unite everyone. Rich and poor, Hindu and Muslim, upper caste and lower caste, every region, every religion, every class, everyone needs salt. Everyone could see the injustice with perfect clarity. You're standing on a beach looking at an ocean that's literally full of salt, and you're legally prohibited from collecting it while simultaneously being forced to buy expensive imported salt or suffer health consequences. The injustice was visceral, immediate, personal, and undeniable. This is why Mohandas Gandhi chose salt for his great act of civil disobedience in 1930, not some abstract economic policy, not a distant political principle. Not even the more economically significant taxes. Salt, something every single Indian understood, needed, and resented being taxed for. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi began his famous salt march from Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad. He was 60 years old. He walked 240 miles over 24 days to the coastal village of Dandi on the Arabian Sea. He started with 78 carefully selected followers. By the time he reached the coast on April 6, thousands had joined the march and millions were watching. At 6:30 in the morning, Gandhi walked into the surf, bent down, and picked up a lump of natural salt formed by evaporation. Muddy, impure, but salt nonetheless. He held it up. He had broken the law. The British Empire's salt monopoly, backed by comprehensive legislation, armed enforcement, and 150 years of precedent, had just been defied by an elderly man in a loincloth picking up mud from a beach. Gandhi said he was shaking the foundations of the British Empire. He wasn't exaggerating. The symbolism was absolutely perfect. An unjust law made visible through the simplest possible act of defiance, collecting salt from a beach. Something so obviously reasonable, so clearly within natural rights, that making it illegal exposed the empire's fundamental illegitimacy. The response was immediate and nationwide. Millions of Indians began making illegal salt. Along every coastline, people collected seawater and evaporated it in pans. In villages across the interior, people processed naturally occurring salt from their own land. The British arrested thousands. By the end of 1930, over 60,000 Indians had been imprisoned for salt-related offenses. But they couldn't arrest everyone. The sheer scale of civil disobedience made enforcement impossible. You can imprison 8,000 people a year when salt collection is being done by desperate poor people trying to feed their families. You cannot imprison millions of people simultaneously engaged in deliberate, organized, public civil disobedience. The system collapsed under the weight of mass defiance. The most dramatic confrontation came on May 21, 1930, at the Darasana Salt Works, a government salt production facility. Gandhi had already been arrested, but the protests continued under new leadership. Sarojini Naidu, a poet and independence activist, led 2,500 peaceful marchers to the salt works. Their plan was to walk into the facility and occupy it nonviolently. British police, equipped with steel-tipped lathis, long wooden batons reinforced with steel, met them at the entrance. American journalist Webb Miller was present and documented what happened next in reports that shocked the world. The marchers approached in organized ranks. Police beat them with lathis. The marchers didn't fight back. They didn't raise their arms to defend themselves. They didn't even flinch. They simply walked forward into the clubs and fell when beaten unconscious. The next rank stepped forward immediately. They were beaten. They fell. Volunteers carried away the injured and the next rank advanced. This continued for hours. Wave after wave of protesters walking deliberately into steel-tipped clubs, being beaten unconscious, carried away bleeding, replaced immediately by the next rank who knew exactly what was coming and walked forward anyway. Miller reported 320 casualties, including 2 dead. The rest had fractured skulls, broken bones, deep lacerations. The images and reports circulated globally. The British Empire, which claimed to represent civilization, law, and order, was shown beating peaceful, unarmed protesters for trying to collect salt from a beach. The moral authority of empire shattered. The salt protests forced negotiations between Gandhi and Viceroy Lord Irwin. In March 1931, they reached the Gandhi-Irwin Pact. Gandhi agreed to suspend the civil disobedience campaign. The British agreed to release political prisoners, and Indians were granted the right to collect salt for domestic consumption only, not for sale. But notice carefully what didn't change. The salt tax remained in force. The monopoly on commercial salt production remained intact. Britain controlled the market and continued collecting revenue. Indians could collect personal use salt from beaches, which was symbolically important but economically meaningless. They still couldn't produce salt commercially. They still couldn't sell it. The government still monopolized commercial production and still taxed it. Britain made a symbolic concession while maintaining the extraction mechanism. The pact was a partial victory that allowed both sides to claim success while changing very little structurally. The salt tax finally ended in 1947 when India gained independence and the interim government led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan abolished it. But even then the story didn't end cleanly. In 1953, independent India reintroduced a salt tax under a different name, the Salt Cess Act. Different government, different name, same concept. Tax something universally needed because it generates reliable revenue. The salt cess remained until 2017, when it was finally eliminated under the Goods and Services Tax Reform, which notably does not tax salt. Think about that timeline. It took 70 years after independence for India to completely eliminate salt taxation. That's how deeply extraction mechanisms embed themselves into systems. Even after the empire falls, even after the colonizers leave, The mechanisms they created persist because new governments still need revenue and taxing universally needed goods is effective. The empire pattern here is extraction through monopolizing necessities, and it repeats across every empire in history. Rome did this with grain from Egypt, taxing it heavily and using the revenue to fund legions. France did this with the gabelle, a salt tax so hated it contributed to the French Revolution. Spain did this with silver from Potosi, monopolizing extraction and using the revenue to fund endless wars until the silver ran out and the empire collapsed. Britain did this with salt in India for 165 years. The mechanism is always identical. Identify a universally needed commodity with inelastic demand, monopolize production and distribution through law backed by violence, criminalize alternatives, tax heavily, use the revenue to fund the military and bureaucracy that maintains the monopoly. The system is self-sustaining. The colonized pay for their own colonization. But here's why this pattern always eventually fails. Taxing survival unites everyone against you in ways that other forms of extraction don't. Luxury taxes create resentment among the wealthy, but the poor don't care. Income taxes create resentment among workers, but the unemployed don't care. Property taxes create resentment among landowners, but renters don't care. But survival taxes unite everyone because everyone needs to survive. The salt tax united Hindus and Muslims. It united upper castes and lower castes. It united every region, every religion, every economic class in India. Rich Indians and poor Indians both needed salt and both resented being prohibited from collecting something freely available in nature. When an empire taxes something people can clearly see as abundant and free, the illegitimacy becomes undeniable. The injustice is too obvious to rationalize away. This is the empire economy, where we decode extraction mechanisms and why they eventually backfire. Britain made Indians pay for their own colonization by taxing survival, but taxing survival created the unity that ended the empire. Gandhi understood this perfectly. He chose salt not because it was the biggest tax revenue source, but because it was the most universally understood injustice. Everyone needed it. Everyone could afford to make it if allowed. Everyone resented being prohibited from collecting it. The Salt March succeeded because it made the empire's illegitimacy visible through the simplest imaginable act: an old man picking up salt from a beach. That shouldn't be revolutionary, but when the law prohibits it, the law reveals itself as fundamentally unjust. And unjust laws break. If you want to keep seeing how empires extract and how extraction accelerates their decline, subscribe.